In the early 14th century, China faced a disaster that would forever alter its history, a catastrophe that, in its scale and terror, rivaled the infamous Black Death that ravaged Europe. But unlike the well-documented history of plague in the West, China's experience remains largely obscure. Imagine a time when entire villages vanished, entire families wiped off the face of the earth, and cities that were once centers of trade and culture fell silent. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of this invisible force, a deadly wave of disease that swept across the vast Mongol Empire. The historical records are fragmentary, but the remnants of this tragedy remain, hauntingly etched into the chronicles of the Yuan dynasty. This was the period when the Mongols, having conquered vast swaths of Asia and Europe, governed China with an iron fist. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, ruled over an empire that connected the East and West like never before. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. Goods from Europe and Asia flowed freely, and the Mongol Empire stood as a beacon of unity in a fragmented world. But beneath the surface of this prosperous empire, disaster was brewing. An unseen enemy was quietly advancing, and it would soon bring the empire to its knees. In the bustling cities of China, the death toll mounted as reports of a strange and lethal illness began to surface. The disease spread rapidly, with symptoms unlike any seen before. Swollen lymph nodes, blood, spitting from the mouth, entire families struck down in mere days. Villages were decimated, and people were left to wonder, how could this have happened? Was it the wrath of heaven, or a punishment for the sins of the people? The traditional Chinese belief in the mandate of heaven suggested that such catastrophes were signs of divine disfavor. But the sheer scale of the death seemed beyond the control of any god or emperor. The plague was not confined to the cities alone. It spread like wildfire across rural China. Once thriving agricultural areas were abandoned as the people fled from the disease, leaving behind empty fields and ghost towns. Entire provinces were struck, and the population of China, already weakened by famine and ecological disasters, began to collapse under the weight of this unprecedented epidemic. In Hunan, it was reported that 90% of the population perished. That statistic, though likely exaggerated, was a stark testament to the horror that gripped the region. The very fabric of society was unraveling, and no one was safe. But the tragedy was not only felt in China. This disaster was part of a much larger global story. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices to distant lands also carried the plague from one corner of the world to another. The Mongols, who had established an empire that stretched from China to Europe, were unwittingly responsible for spreading the disease that would leave a mark on the entire world. The plague did not just devastate China. It traveled westward, reaching the Middle East, Europe, and beyond, where it would go on to cause one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Yet, while Europe's story is told in vivid detail, the story of the Black Death in China is more subtle, fragmented, and often overlooked. It is a history that has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the more well-known accounts of plague in the West. But this part of the story is just as important. It reveals the vast interconnectedness of the medieval world, and underscores the fragility of human civilization in the face of pandemics. Today, we will delve into this lesser-known chapter of the Black Death's legacy. We will explore how the plague ravaged China, tracing its spread from region to region, and examine the social and cultural impacts it had on the people of China. We will look at the responses of both the Chinese government and the people, as they faced this deadly epidemic. And we will consider how the experience of the Black Death in China informs our understanding of global pandemics today. In this story, we won't just focus on the scientific aspects of the plague, such as its origins and the theories about how it spread. Instead, we will bring to light the human side of the story, the fear, the desperation, and the resilience of a people faced with an unknown and invisible killer. The plague in China was not just a medical phenomenon. It was a social, political, and cultural event that shaped the course of Chinese history and left a lasting impact on the world. As we piece together this fragmented history, we will discover that the Black Death in China was not just a footnote in global history. It was a pivotal moment that connects the East and the West in a shared narrative of suffering, survival, and ultimately resilience. So let us take a closer look at the Black Death in China, its origins, its devastating impact, and the lessons we can learn from this forgotten chapter in history. The tragedy of the Black Death in China is more than just a story of death and disease. It is a reminder of the vulnerability of even the greatest empires to forces beyond their control. It teaches us about the fragility of human civilization, the interconnectedness of the world, and the power of nature to shape the course of history. This is a story that not only reflects the past, but also offers valuable insights into our present-day struggles with global pandemics. In the end, the Black Death in China is a story that is just as important as the European narrative. It is a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful or advanced, is immune to the forces of nature. The plague did not care about borders, and it did not care about empires. It spread indiscriminately, leaving behind a wake of destruction that reshaped the world forever. And as we face new pandemics today, this story serves as both a warning and a lesson about the importance of preparedness, resilience, and unity in the face of disaster. At the dawn of the 14th century, China was firmly under the rule of the Yuan dynasty, an empire founded by the legendary Mongol conqueror Kublai Khan. Having swept across much of Asia and parts of Europe, the Mongols forged an empire of unprecedented size, uniting vast stretches of land from the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of China and beyond to the distant reaches of Europe. The Mongol Empire became a bridge between the East and the West, a conduit for goods, ideas, and cultures that had never before mingled in such a profound way. The Silk Road, which had been a network of trade routes for centuries, flourished like never before under Mongol rule, as caravans laden with silk, spices, tea, and other treasures traversed the empire's vast expanse. This golden age of trade and cultural exchange was a testament to the Mongols' remarkable governance, which was known as the Pax Mongolica. The peace they enforced across their territories allowed merchants, diplomats, and adventurers to move freely, crossing borders that had previously been closed off by warring states. Cities like Chang'an, Kaifeng, and later Beijing became bustling hubs of commerce, where merchants from Europe, Persia, India, and beyond would gather, exchanging goods and ideas that would shape civilizations for centuries to come. But as the Mongols opened up the East to the West, they also unwittingly paved the way for something far more sinister: disease. While the Silk Road was renowned for facilitating trade, it also became a highway for the spread of epidemics. The same caravans that carried precious goods across the empire also transported rats, fleas, and pathogens, all of which would play a crucial role in the devastation that was to come. It was through these very trade routes that the Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, would make its way to China. The plague, which would soon devastate not just China but the entire world, found fertile ground along these ancient trade paths. As Mongol armies and merchants crossed vast distances, They carried more than just commodities. They carried fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the plague. These fleas, hitching rides on rats, were capable of traveling long distances, hiding in the crevices of caravans and ships. And as these infected rats traveled from one region to the next, they brought with them an invisible, relentless force of destruction. By the time the plague reached China, it had already wreaked havoc in Central Asia, where it had begun its deadly march toward the west. In the 1330s, the Mongol-led city of Kaffa in Crimea became one of the first places where the plague was introduced to Europe. The disease was carried by Genoese traders who fled the city after it was besieged by Mongol forces, unknowingly bringing the infection with them to Mediterranean ports. But long before it reached Europe, the plague had already taken root in China, with reports of widespread outbreaks beginning in the early 1330s. One of the first areas to be hit by the disease was the province of Hunan, located in southern China. In 1331, a devastating pestilence swept through the region, killing as many as 90% of the population. While this figure might seem exaggerated, it underscores the sheer scale of the catastrophe. Whole families were wiped out, and entire communities were decimated, leaving behind ghost towns where only the dead remained. Descriptions of the plague's symptoms, including swollen lymph nodes and coughing up blood, closely resembled the signs of the bubonic plague, which was now spreading like wildfire across the empire. The very trade routes that had once brought prosperity to China now became conduits for death. As the plague spread from Hunan, it moved northward, striking the densely populated provinces around the Yuan capital in modern-day Beijing. In these urban centers where people lived in close quarters, the disease spread rapidly. With no understanding of contagion, the Chinese people, like their counterparts in Europe, were helpless in the face of the invisible killer. But it was not just the urban areas that were affected. The plague spread to rural regions, where decimated agricultural communities already struggling with famine, drought, and locust plagues. These environmental stresses had already weakened the population, and now, with the arrival of the plague, many villages simply vanished from the map. The disease spread quickly, leaving behind a trail of death and devastation that could not be stopped. As the plague continued its march across China, the Mongol rulers were faced with a growing crisis. The Yuan dynasty, which had initially brought stability and prosperity to the empire, found itself struggling to cope with the unimaginable loss of life. While the Mongol Empire had long been an epitome of vast interconnectedness, it now seemed that this very interconnectivity was both a blessing and a curse. The trade routes that once fueled the empire's economy had become the vehicle for an unstoppable disease, and the empire's ability to manage the crisis seemed to falter under the weight of the plague's devastating toll. In the face of such devastation, the people of China turned to their faith and traditional beliefs. Many believed the plague was a punishment from the gods, a sign that the mandate of heaven had been lost. In Chinese culture, the mandate of heaven was the divine right of rulers to govern, and when natural disasters or plagues struck, it was seen as a sign of divine disfavor. The Mongol rulers, despite their military and political power, were not immune to the loss of the mandate of heaven, and the suffering caused by the plague contributed to growing unrest within the empire. Despite the chaos, the people of China found ways to cope with the plague. Medical practitioners, though lacking modern understanding of germs and bacteria, took measures to treat the sick, using herbs, acupuncture, and various forms of surgery, including lancing abscesses. In some areas, incense was burned to ward off the bad air that was believed to carry the disease. In a time of such desperation, many also turned to religion, hoping that divine intervention might bring an end to the plague's relentless march. As the 1330s and 1340s wore on, the plague's grip on China tightened. It seemed to move with a terrifying consistency, wiping out entire villages and provinces, leaving the population decimated. By the time the worst of the outbreaks had passed, the Chinese population had been significantly reduced. Estimates suggest that the plague, in conjunction with other disasters like famine and war, may have killed as much as a third of China's population during this period. The legacy of the plague was profound. It not only devastated China, but also contributed to the eventual fall of the Yuan dynasty. The loss of life, coupled with the political instability and economic disruption caused by the disease, weakened the Mongol rulers' grip on power. In the years that followed, China would see the rise of the Ming dynasty, led by Zhu Yanzhang, a man who, as a young boy, had witnessed the horrors of the plague and famine. His experiences during these years would shape his future, as he led the revolt that toppled the Yuan dynasty and established the Ming. The plague that swept across China in the 14th century is a reminder of the fragility of human civilization. While the Mongol Empire had connected the East and West in ways never before seen, it also brought with it an unintended consequence disease. The same trade routes that carried prosperity and cultural exchange also carried death. And as the world grapples with the threat of modern pandemics, we can look back at this history and see how interconnectedness, while a powerful force for growth and progress, can also be a double-edged sword. Before the plague struck, China was already teetering on the brink of crisis. For years, the empire had been grappling with a series of environmental and social challenges that left its people vulnerable to catastrophe. The land, once fertile and bountiful, had been ravaged by relentless locust swarms. The tiny, hungry insects descended in waves, devouring crops and reducing the nation's agricultural output to almost nothing. In the wake of this devastation, droughts swept across the plains, further crippling China's ability to feed its vast population. Fields once lush with rice, wheat, and other vital crops turned barren and cracked under the scorching heat of the relentless sun. The food shortages were not just an inconvenience, they were a matter of life and death. Famine spread quickly, and the specter of hunger loomed over millions of families. Desperate for food, many turned to anything they could find, foraging for roots, berries, or anything that could stave off the gnawing hunger. But despite their efforts, the famine was unforgiving, and as months dragged on, the population grew weaker. A population already suffering from poverty, weakened by hunger, and on edge due to mounting hardships, was now ripe for a greater threat, a disease that would sweep through their villages and cities with a ferocity unseen before. Yet the environmental strain was not the only crisis China faced in the early 14th century. Beneath the surface of Mongol rule, tensions were simmering. Despite the Mongols' vast empire, which stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of China, the people remained discontent. The Mongols, though powerful, were seen by many as foreign rulers, and their reign had often been met with rebellion and unrest. The native Chinese population chafed under Mongol rule, and the social fabric was starting to tear apart. Many felt oppressed by the Mongol rulers' taxation policies, their military conscription, and their preferential treatment of Mongol and Central Asian elites. In this already unstable environment, political and social tensions simmered. Rebellions erupted in several provinces, and local uprisings became increasingly common, With each passing year, the Mongol dynasty's grip on power weakened, and internal strife threatened to tear the empire apart. The common people, pushed to the brink by the endless cycle of famine and political turmoil, began to look for outlets for their frustrations. In this volatile atmosphere, the seeds of rebellion and unrest were planted, creating the perfect conditions for a disaster of epic proportions. But nothing could have prepared China for the arrival of the Black Death. The plague, a disease that had already spread across the East, soon made its way to the heart of the empire. And when it arrived, it found a nation already weakened by years of ecological disaster and simmering political unrest. It was like lighting a match in a powder keg. The Black Death spread like wildfire, igniting a panic that swept across the land, leaving destruction in its wake. The impact of the plague was devastating. With the population already weakened by hunger and famine, the disease found fertile ground to spread. The symptoms of the plague, swollen lymph nodes, fever, and violent coughing, struck quickly and without mercy. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of days. Whole villages were decimated, and cities that once bustled with activity became eerily quiet, the streets empty of life. The disease did not discriminate. It took the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the rulers and the ruled. It swept through the nation with terrifying speed, claiming lives by the millions. As the plague spread, the people of China were gripped by fear and despair. Many turned to religion, praying for deliverance from the wrath of heaven. Others saw the plague as a sign of divine punishment for the sins of the Mongol rulers. Amidst the chaos, the political system began to crumble. Local officials, unable to deal with the overwhelming death toll and the chaos in their provinces, fled or abandoned their posts. With no central authority to coordinate relief efforts, the suffering intensified. Those who were fortunate enough to survive had to contend with the economic collapse that followed. The once thriving trade routes that had connected China to the rest of the world fell silent as merchants and traders perished, and transportation came to a halt. The plague not only devastated China's population, but also crippled its economy. The agricultural sector, already struggling with years of drought and famine, collapsed as workers died in droves. The labor shortage led to a breakdown in food production, worsening the famine. In the cities, businesses shut down, and the once vibrant marketplaces turned into ghost towns. The social structure, already weakened by rebellion and discontent, began to disintegrate. The people, disillusioned and demoralized, began to lose hope. The Mongol rulers, who had once boasted of their empire's strength and vastness, now found themselves powerless in the face of the plague. Their armies, decimated by the disease, were unable to maintain order or defend against uprisings. The empire's ability to govern was severely hampered as the leadership faltered and local officials struggled to maintain control. The rebellion that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long now erupted in full force. Peasants, driven to desperation by hunger, disease, and oppression, rose up against their Mongol overlords. These uprisings, fueled by the rage of a population already on the edge, spread quickly, further destabilizing the empire. As the plague raged on, the Yuan dynasty's control over China began to unravel. The government, overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis, could do little to stop the collapse. The combination of ecological disaster, famine, disease, and rebellion created a perfect storm that tore apart the fabric of Chinese society. In the years that followed, the Mongol dynasty would fall, and a new era would begin under the Ming dynasty. But the legacy of the plague and the devastation it caused would never be forgotten. It was a reminder of the fragility of human civilization and the ways in which environmental, social, and political stresses can converge to bring about disaster. The arrival of the Black Death in China, in many ways, marked the end of an era. It was a catastrophic event that exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful empires. The Mongols, despite their vast empire and military might, were ultimately powerless in the face of this unstoppable force. And as the plague spread, it highlighted the interconnectedness of the world, how the same trade routes that had once brought prosperity and cultural exchange could also bring destruction on a global scale. For the people of China, the Black Death was a disaster unlike any they had ever experienced. It not only decimated the population, but also tore apart the social and political fabric of the empire. And yet, despite the unimaginable suffering, the people endured. The resilience of the Chinese people in the face of such devastation would eventually lead to the rebuilding of the nation and the rise of a new dynasty. But the lessons of the plague and the toll it took on China would remain etched in history for generations to come. The first signs of the plague in China appeared in the early 1330s, and what began as a mysterious illness soon escalated into an unrelenting catastrophe that would sweep across the empire. It all started in the province of Hunan, located in southern China, where an unknown disease began to ravage the population. It spread quickly, moving through villages and towns with a terrifying speed. What was once a peaceful, bustling community was suddenly struck by death on an unprecedented scale. One report from the time claimed that in certain areas, 9 out of every 10 people died, a staggering statistic that conveyed the sheer horror of the situation. At first, the people of Hunan had no idea what they were facing. The symptoms of the disease were unlike any seen before. Victims began to experience swelling in their lymph nodes, particularly in the armpits, groin, and neck, and this swelling was often followed by excruciating pain. These lumps, often referred to as buboes, were the hallmark of a disease that seemed to strike without warning. But the suffering did not stop there. Some victims began to spit up blood, their lungs seemingly torn apart by the illness. This combination of symptoms led many to call it the clotted blood plague, a name that seemed to fit the grisly reality of what was happening. Despite the clear symptoms, there was no single term for the disease. Instead, the descriptions were more about what was witnessed: the telltale swelling of the lymph nodes, the blood-spitting victims, the agonizing pain that came with each breath. These vivid accounts were passed along by word of mouth, and though they did not fully explain the nature of the disease, they conveyed a deep sense of dread. This illness was like nothing the people had ever seen, and the toll it took was impossible to ignore. The disease spread rapidly throughout Hunan, moving from village to village with such swiftness that by the time officials arrived to investigate, entire communities had already been decimated. In some areas, it was reported that nearly every single person in a family had died, leaving nothing but empty homes and lifeless streets. These ghost towns, once vibrant centers of daily life, were now abandoned and desolate, a chilling reminder of the plague's devastating reach. As families were wiped out, entire villages disappeared from the map, and the landscape began to change, marked by the absence of human life. In these early days of the outbreak, the response was chaotic. Local officials, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster, struggled to coordinate any sort of relief. The plague spread too quickly, and the sickness was so contagious that even trying to provide aid risked spreading the disease further. Quarantine measures, if they were implemented at all, were often ineffective, and the lack of understanding about how the disease spread only made the situation worse. Many people believed that the plague was a punishment from the heavens, a divine wrath for some collective sin, and that there was little anyone could do to stop it. While the people of Hunan were grappling with this unknown plague, the rest of China remained unaware of what was unfolding in the south. But as the disease spread, it quickly made its way into neighboring regions, creating a ripple effect that would eventually reach the heart of the Mongol Empire. By the mid-1330s, the plague was no longer confined to southern China. It began to appear in other provinces, such as Hebei, Shandong, and Shanxi. The disease, carried by fleas that traveled on rats, moved rapidly along the trade routes that connected China's bustling cities with the rest of Asia. The Silk Road, which had once brought prosperity to the empire, now became the very conduit through which death spread from one region to the next. As the disease advanced, entire cities were struck. In some areas, it was said that the streets were filled with bodies that were not just left to decay, but were often abandoned in the open because there was no one left to care for them. The sick and the dying were cast aside, and even those who tried to bury the dead found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of victims. Death was no longer a rare occurrence, but a constant presence. The city of Hangzhou, a major economic and cultural center, was reported to have been devastated by the plague. Once a thriving metropolis, it was left almost deserted, with reports claiming that the majority of its population had perished within weeks. In the midst of the horror, some people began to look for explanations. The most prevalent theory was that the plague was a punishment from the heavens, a sign that the Mongol rulers had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine approval needed to rule. This idea, deeply rooted in Chinese cosmology, suggested that the Mongols, having conquered China, were now being punished for their perceived failures. In governing, the suffering of the people was seen as a cosmic retribution, and many turned to religious rituals, hoping for divine intervention to stop the plague. Incense was burned, offerings were made, and prayers were recited in the hopes that the gods might show mercy. But no amount of prayer could stop the tide of death that was sweeping through the land. As the plague spread northward, it became clear that this was no ordinary illness. The symptoms were unmistakable, and the speed at which it spread was like wildfire. It was soon recognized as a form of the bubonic plague, a disease that had ravaged Europe years before. Yet, in China, it was far more deadly. The lack of a clear understanding of how the disease was transmitted made it all the more terrifying. No one knew how to protect themselves, and by the time a diagnosis was made, it was often too late. This was the beginning of a long and painful chapter in Chinese history. The disease continued to ravage the population for years, moving from province to province, sparing no one. The economic impact was catastrophic. Trade slowed to a halt, and agricultural production was decimated. The once thriving cities and villages that dotted the Chinese landscape were now empty shells, with only the ruins of what once was left behind. The effects of the plague were felt for generations, and it would take years, even centuries, for China to recover fully from the damage done. But despite the immense toll the plague took on China, the spirit of the people endured. Even in the face of such overwhelming devastation, they rebuilt. And though the plague would remain a dark stain on the history of the Yuan dynasty, it was the resilience of the Chinese people that would ultimately carry the empire through its darkest days. Through their perseverance, they would eventually recover and rise again, though forever scarred by the tragedy that had nearly brought them to the brink of collapse. The plague's journey across Asia is a tale of relentless devastation, a story that begins in the harsh terrain of Central Asia, near the Tian Shan Mountains, just west of China. This mountainous region, historically known as a crossroads for trade and migration, became the birthplace of one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Ancient DNA studies conducted in recent years have pinpointed this area as the likely origin of the strain of the plague bacterium Yersinia pestis during the early 1330s. The bacteria, carried by fleas that infested rats, spread across the region in the wake of Mongol armies and merchants traveling along the Silk Road. These trade routes, which connected the east to the west, were about to become the unwitting conduits for one of the most destructive forces the world had ever seen. The Mongols, with their vast empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia all the way to China, had established an unprecedented level of connectivity. The Pax Mongolica, the peace established by Mongol rule, had opened the Silk Road to commerce, culture, and diplomacy. But this same interconnectedness, which had brought prosperity and stability to the empire, also proved to be a double-edged sword. It allowed the plague to travel with terrifying speed, carried by traders, Mongol soldiers, and even the very animals that traveled with them. Rats, infested with fleas carrying the plague bacteria, found their way onto ships, caravans, and military expeditions, unknowingly spreading the disease from one corner of the empire to the other. As the plague spread through Central Asia, it moved eastward, eventually reaching China by the early 1330s. The first reports of the disease in China came from the northern provinces of Hebei and Shanxi, regions that bordered the Yuan capital of Dadu, modern-day Beijing. These areas, with their dense populations and thriving trade networks, were ripe for infection. The disease spread rapidly, overwhelming entire cities and towns. In some cases, entire populations were wiped out within days, leaving behind nothing but empty streets and abandoned homes. It was as if death had swept through with no mercy, leaving only silence in its wake. The descriptions of the plague's symptoms were chillingly familiar to those who had heard of the devastation it had caused in Europe. Victims began to experience swollen lymph nodes, which would grow painfully large in the armpits, neck, or groin. These swellings, known as buboes, were the hallmark of the bubonic plague. But this plague was even more horrifying as some victims began to bleed from the mouth and nose, a terrifying sign that their internal organs were being ravaged by the bacteria. The disease spread rapidly through direct contact, as the fleas infected more rats, which in turn spread the infection to humans. In some instances, the infected would die within a matter of days, their bodies succumbing to the relentless bacteria before they could even comprehend the full extent of the disease. What began in the north soon spread throughout China, following the same trade routes that had made the empire rich. As it spread, it moved faster than anyone could track, moving with devastating swiftness from town to town, city to city. The northern regions of China, where the plague first made its mark, were hit the hardest. In Hebei and Shanxi, reports claimed that entire towns were left abandoned, their streets haunted by the memory of those who had perished. It was said that no one was left to bury the dead, and so bodies piled up in the streets, further spreading the disease. The speed at which the plague spread was staggering. The Yuan dynasty, which had once thrived on its ability to control vast territories and maintain trade networks, now found itself helpless in the face of this invisible enemy. The imperial government, overwhelmed by the scale of the devastation, could do little to stop the plague's relentless advance. In fact, the sheer scale of the outbreak likely hindered any effective response, as local officials were often unable to mobilize the necessary resources to contain the disease. With little knowledge of how the disease spread, the authorities were left to watch in horror as entire regions were wiped out, one after the other. By 1334, the plague had spread even further, reaching the cities and provinces closer to the Yuan capital. The government's inability to effectively address the crisis compounded the sense of hopelessness that gripped the population. In places like Dedu, which was once a thriving metropolis, people could only watch as their neighbors fell ill and their families succumbed to the disease. The cities were decimated, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of a once great civilization. Even the imperial family was not spared, with reports suggesting that some members of the royal court were also struck down by the disease. As the plague continued to spread throughout China, it began to take on the characteristics of an unstoppable force. It ravaged not only the population, but also the economy. Trade came to a halt, as merchants and travelers were either too afraid to journey or had been struck by the disease themselves. The vast trade routes that had once been the lifeblood of the Yuan Empire now lay dormant, further isolating the regions affected by the plague. The once prosperous agricultural sectors, already weakened by drought and famine, were left in ruins. The labor shortage caused by the deaths of so many workers meant that crops went unharvested, leading to even more hunger and suffering. The impact of the plague was not only felt in the cities and towns, but also in the countryside, where rural communities were struck just as hard. The already struggling rural population was further devastated by the disease, leaving behind fields that would never be tilled again, and villages that would never be rebuilt. The plague tore through every level of society, sparing no one, regardless of their social standing. In response to the crisis, the people of China turned to their faith. Many believed that the plague was a punishment from the gods, a sign of divine displeasure with the Mongol rulers. People turned to religious rituals, burning incense, making offerings, and praying for the plague to end. However, despite these desperate attempts to appease the gods, the plague showed no signs of slowing down. For some, the endless cycle of death and suffering seemed like the final judgment, a sign that the end of the world had come. As the plague continued to spread across China, the Yuan dynasty found itself on the brink of collapse. The empire's once vibrant economy, fueled by trade and prosperity, was now in ruins. Entire regions had been depopulated, and the political stability that the Mongols had once enjoyed was rapidly deteriorating. The plague had not only destroyed the people of China, but had also shattered the very foundations of the empire. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force now found itself facing the inevitable unraveling of the Yuan dynasty. While the plague ravaged northern China with an intensity that left entire cities abandoned, it did not strike the empire with the same force across all regions. The disparity in its impact raises intriguing questions about how the disease spread through such a vast and diverse land. In particular, southern China seemed relatively less affected by the initial waves of the plague, a stark contrast to the devastation experienced in the northern provinces. This regional variation has prompted historians to revisit the narrative of the plague's journey through China, suggesting that its spread might have been more complex than a single, unstoppable wave of destruction. In northern China, where the disease first made its mark, the impact was devastating. By 1333, provinces like Hebei and Shanxi had been struck with such ferocity that entire populations were wiped out. Cities that were once bustling hubs of culture, commerce, and governance were left in ruins, their streets eerily quiet as the plague tore through the land. The symptoms of the disease, swollen lymph nodes, bloody coughing, and sudden death spared no one, regardless of their social standing. In some cases, entire families were wiped out in days, leaving behind nothing but ghost towns. The scale of the death and the speed with which it spread were unlike anything seen before in China. But as the disease spread southward, something unusual happened. Southern China, with its warmer climate, fertile land, and large population centers like Hangzhou, Guangzhou, and Nanjing, seemed to be less affected by the early stages of the plague. While the northern regions of the empire were decimated, southern China remained relatively untouched for a time. This raised questions among scholars about the nature of the plague's spread. Was the plague merely following the established trade routes, or was there something else at play? Could there have been multiple outbreaks occurring at different times and locations, rather than a single, continuous wave of destruction? Some historians argue that the plague may have entered China in waves, with the initial outbreak in the north setting the stage for subsequent epidemics in the south. This theory suggests that the disease first made its way into the northern provinces via trade routes from Central Asia, carried by Mongol armies and merchants. The disease, perhaps already smoldering in the northern regions, spread rapidly across the cities and towns there, but the plague did not immediately reach the south, allowing southern China to remain relatively unaffected by the initial onslaught. The delay in the spread of the disease to the south could explain why these regions saw less devastation in the early years of the pandemic. However, as the years wore on, the plague began to move southward, eventually striking the provinces of Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Guangdong. By the mid-1330s, the disease had spread beyond the northern borders of China, and the full scale of the devastation became apparent. Even in southern China, the disease began to take its toll, though the death rate was not as catastrophic as in the north. Towns and villages in southern China were still struck by the plague, but the relative isolation of these regions, combined with their later exposure to the disease, may have helped mitigate the scale of destruction. The reasons behind this regional disparity are complex and multifaceted. One possible explanation is that geographic factors played a role in the plague's spread. Northern China, with its proximity to Central Asia, was more directly connected to the initial outbreak of the disease. The Mongol-led trade networks and military campaigns that crisscrossed this region may have facilitated the rapid spread of the plague from Central Asia into the heart of the empire. Southern China, on the other hand, was somewhat more isolated from these direct routes, and it may have taken longer for the disease to reach these regions. Another potential factor contributing to the slower spread in southern China could have been the differences in climate and environmental conditions. The warmer and more humid conditions in the south may have created an environment that was less conducive to the spread of the plague's primary vector, the rat flea. The cooler, drier conditions in the north, with more widespread rodent populations, may have allowed the fleas to thrive, facilitating the spread of the disease. In contrast, the southern regions may have seen fewer outbreaks, as the fleas were less able to sustain the plague in the more humid, tropical climate. Moreover, the timing of the outbreaks in different regions of China also raises interesting questions. The plague that struck northern China in the early 1330s may have simply taken longer to reach the south due to logistical factors. With the empire already in a state of disarray, ravaged by famine, rebellion, and political instability, it is possible that the disease spread sporadically, in fits and starts. In some cases, the disease may have been brought south by fleeing refugees, or perhaps by merchants and travelers who had already been exposed to the plague in the north. The fact that the southern regions were not hit as hard initially does not necessarily mean they were spared. It may simply indicate that the disease took longer to reach them. Despite the differences in impact across the empire, the plague eventually found its way to nearly every corner of China. Southern China, despite its relative delay in exposure, was not immune to the disease. As the years passed, the disease spread through the south with increasing intensity, culminating in a widespread outbreak that decimated the population. The economy, already weakened by previous famines and droughts, was further crippled as the disease killed both the working class and the elite. Markets collapsed and trade came to a halt, further exacerbating the crisis. The ultimate toll of the plague on China is difficult to quantify, as the records from the time are sparse and often unreliable. However, estimates suggest that the death toll could have been as high as 25 to 30% of the population. This staggering loss of life not only devastated the population, but also had profound social, economic, and political consequences. The Yuan dynasty, already weakened by internal strife and rebellion, was further undermined by the plague. The loss of life and the breakdown of social order contributed to the fall of the Mongol dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty in the mid-14th century. In retrospect, the regional disparities in the plague's impact across China offer important insights into the nature of pandemics and the factors that influence their spread. The Black Death's path through China was not a simple, linear progression. It was a series of outbreaks that moved at different speeds and affected different regions at different times. While northern China suffered early and devastating losses, southern China remained relatively unaffected for a time, only to face its own wave of destruction later on. This pattern of spread challenges the simplistic view of the plague as a single, continuous wave of death and destruction, suggesting instead that pandemics can unfold in complex, unpredictable ways, shaped by a variety of factors, including geography, timing, and human movement. As we reflect on the events of the 14th century, we are reminded of the power of pandemics to reshape societies. The Black Death's toll on China was profound, not only in terms of the loss of life, but also in the way it altered the course of history. It was a reminder of the vulnerability of even the most powerful empires, and how the interconnectedness of the world, though it can bring prosperity, can also become a conduit for disaster. The plague in China was not just a tragedy of the past. It serves as a sobering reminder of the challenges we continue to face in the fight against global pandemics today. In the face of the devastating plague that swept across China in the early 14th century, the Chinese people turned to both spiritual and practical responses to cope with the unimaginable suffering that surrounded them. The scale of the death, the suddenness of its arrival, and the rapid spread of the disease left communities in a state of shock and fear. For a people who had long believed that natural and societal events were governed by divine forces, the plague was an overwhelming sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Many believed that the disease was a punishment sent from the heavens, a manifestation of divine wrath for the sins of the people or the rulers. This belief was deeply rooted in the traditional Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven. The idea that the ruler's right to govern was granted by divine forces. When disasters like the plague struck, it was seen as a loss of the mandate, a sign that the emperor had lost the favor of the gods and could no longer rule with divine approval. The concept of the mandate of heaven had been a central pillar of Chinese political philosophy for centuries, and it dictated not only the legitimacy of the ruler, but also the well-being of the empire. If the empire was prosperous, it was a sign that the emperor had the approval of the gods. If calamities such as floods, famines, or plagues struck, it was interpreted as a loss of this mandate, and the ruler was blamed for the misfortune. In the case of the plague, many Chinese people believed that the Mongol rulers, having come from foreign lands, had failed to govern in accordance with the will of the heavens. As the death toll mounted and the empire seemed to unravel, the belief that the plague was a punishment became deeply entrenched in the minds of the people. Communities across China responded to this crisis in ways that combined their spiritual beliefs with practical actions. Religious ceremonies and rituals became central to daily life as people sought to appease the gods and secure divine protection. Temples became gathering places where offerings of food, incense, and other symbolic gifts were made in an effort to stop the plague. Some communities organized mass prayers, hoping that the gods would take mercy on them and bring an end to the suffering. These rituals often included public processions, where large groups of people would carry effigies of gods or spirits, believing that these acts of devotion would drive away evil influences and restore harmony. One of the most common rituals involved the burning of incense, which was thought to purify the air and drive away the bad vapors believed to carry the disease. The practice of burning incense was rooted in the belief that miasma, or the bad air, could carry illness, and that fumigating the air with incense would cleanse it and prevent further contagion. It was not just about spiritual appeasement, but also about creating a sense of control in a time when much of life seemed to be spiraling out of control. The burning of incense in homes, streets, and temples was a way to take action, even when there was little understanding of the true cause of the disease. In addition to these spiritual rituals, practical measures were also taken to curb the spread of the plague. Chinese physicians, though lacking the modern understanding of contagion, had long developed their own medical practices and knowledge. They may not have understood the concept of germs, but they knew that isolation and cleanliness were important in preventing the spread of disease. Physicians advocated for avoiding contact with the sick, a practice that aligned with modern quarantine measures, even though the rationale behind it was rooted more in superstition than science. Families with members who fell ill were often isolated, and sometimes entire households were abandoned as their loved ones succumbed to the disease. Fumigation was another common practice. People believed that smoke from burning herbs could purify the air and prevent illness from spreading. Homes were fumigated with aromatic plants like mugwort and other herbs that were thought to have protective qualities. This practice, though primitive in its understanding, showed an intuitive response to the invisible threat that surrounded them. While they may not have known about the disease's bacterial nature, the people of China instinctively turned to the natural world for solutions, burning herbs and spices in the hope that they would purify their surroundings. The rapid burial of the dead was another practical response. In an effort to prevent the disease from spreading, Chinese communities quickly disposed of the bodies of the deceased. This was not just a medical precaution, but also a cultural practice tied to the belief that the dead, if left unburied, could bring about further misfortune. The sheer number of bodies overwhelmed the burial customs. In many areas, mass graves were dug to accommodate the enormous death toll. The swift disposal of the dead was a pragmatic response, even though it was often carried out in the face of chaos, with little time to mourn or properly honor the deceased. Yet, as effective as these measures might have been in providing some semblance of order, they were far from sufficient in halting the plague. The disease continued to spread, claiming more lives every day, leaving the population decimated and the country in a state of despair. The devastation caused by the plague was so great that it shattered the very foundations of society. In cities, markets that had once thrived with the bustle of commerce became eerily silent. The labor force was depleted, leading to food shortages and economic collapse. Even the imperial court, though distant from the worst of the plague, was not immune. The Mongol rulers, already seen as foreign oppressors by many, were blamed for the calamity. As the mandate of heaven had seemingly been lost, and with it, the ability of the Yuan dynasty to govern effectively. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the Chinese people's resilience was evident in their response to the crisis. They turned to their spiritual beliefs to find solace Even as they took practical steps to mitigate the disease's spread, these combined efforts, both spiritual and practical, reflect the deep connection between belief and action in Chinese culture. The rituals, though not scientifically effective, provided a sense of comfort and unity in a time of profound suffering. The actions taken, from fumigation to quarantine, though imperfect, laid the groundwork for future efforts to combat pandemics. As the plague continued to devastate China, it became clear that no single approach could save the empire. But through their perseverance, the people began to rebuild, using the lessons learned from this dark period. The memory of the Black Death would endure, shaping the future responses to pandemics for generations to come. It was a time of immense suffering, but also a time of profound spiritual reflection and practical resilience. Through both, the people of China found the strength to survive, even in the face of such overwhelming devastation. The impact of the Black Death on China was undeniable, and by the 1350s, the once mighty Yuan dynasty was on the brink of collapse. The Mongol rulers, who had once commanded an empire that stretched across Asia and into Europe, found their power weakening as internal strife, social unrest, famine, and repeated epidemics eroded the very foundations of their rule. These compounded crises, particularly the devastation caused by the plague, sent shockwaves throughout the empire, leaving entire regions depopulated, economies shattered, and a broken populace struggling to survive. The Mongol Empire, which had been heralded for its vast connections and military might, was now unraveling, and the forces of nature and human despair were pushing it toward an inevitable collapse. The Black Death, which swept through northern China in the early 1330s, had already set the stage for the downfall of the Yuan dynasty. But by the mid-14th century, it was clear that the disease's impact had been more profound than just a health crisis. As the plague continued to decimate the population, it left entire villages abandoned, markets closed, and entire regions without enough people to sustain the agricultural or economic systems that had once supported them. The economy, already weakened by years of drought and famine, was now crippled further by the staggering loss of life. The once thriving Silk Road trade routes became ghostly paths, deserted by merchants and travelers who had either fled or succumbed to the disease. As the plague spread, it was compounded by other natural disasters, such as locust swarms that ravaged crops and droughts that dried up rivers, further pushing China to the brink of disaster. Historians argue that the combination of the plague and these environmental catastrophes played a critical role in the downfall of the Yuan dynasty. In many ways, the empire was already weakened before the plague arrived, but the disease acted as a final blow. The social unrest that followed, fueled by food shortages, economic collapse, and the inability of the government to effectively address the crisis, further destabilized the empire. The central authority of the Yuan dynasty began to disintegrate as local officials either abandoned their posts or were powerless in the face of the overwhelming devastation. Rebellions sparked throughout the empire, and it was in this environment of chaos and despair that a young rebel leader would rise to change the course of Chinese history. Zhu Yuanzhang, who would later become the first emperor of the Ming dynasty, witnessed the Black Death's devastation firsthand. Born into a peasant family in the early 1300s, Zhu was orphaned by the plague at a young age. His family was one of the countless victims of the disease, and the loss of his parents left him with little to his name. He was taken in by a Buddhist monastery, where he lived for several years, growing up in a world ravaged by the consequences of the plague. His early life was marked by the harsh realities of famine, disease, and social upheaval, and these experiences would shape his worldview and his future ambitions. By the time Zhu became an adult, China was in the midst of one of the most tumultuous periods in its history. The Yuan dynasty, weakened by the plague and other natural disasters, was on the brink of collapse. As the Mongol rulers struggled to maintain control over their vast empire, many Chinese people, long resentful of foreign rule, began to turn toward rebellion. Zhu, fueled by a desire for justice and a deep anger at the suffering caused by the Mongol rulers, became one of the most prominent leaders in the anti-Mongol movement. His rise to power was fueled by his deep understanding of the suffering of the common people, as well as his ability to rally support among those who had suffered the most during the plague and its aftermath. Zhu's leadership was characterized by his ability to unite disparate groups of rebels under a common cause. His army grew rapidly, and his tactics proved to be both effective and ruthless. His forces fought their way through the empire, gaining support from peasants, merchants, and former soldiers who had been disillusioned by the failure of the Yuan dynasty to protect them. By the mid-1350s, Zhu and his forces had captured large swaths of territory, and the Mongols, already weakened by the plague and internal rebellions, found themselves facing an insurmountable threat. Zhu's rise to power is closely linked to the timing of the 1344-1345 plague outbreaks, which devastated many parts of China. The widespread suffering caused by the disease and the subsequent social breakdown were key factors that contributed to Zhu's ability to gain support. The Mongols, who had once ruled over a vast empire, were now viewed as incapable of managing the crises that had overwhelmed the country. The plague, along with other calamities, had eroded the Yuan dynasty's legitimacy in the eyes of many Chinese people, and they turned to Zhu as a leader who could restore order and bring justice to the empire. In 1368, after years of rebellion and warfare, Zhu Yuanzhang succeeded in overthrowing the Mongols and establishing the Ming dynasty. His coronation marked the end of Mongol rule in China and the beginning of a new era, one in which the Chinese people once again took control of their destiny. The rise of the Ming dynasty was not just a political victory. It was a symbolic triumph for the Chinese people who had endured years of plague, famine, and foreign oppression. Under Zhu's leadership, the Ming dynasty would go on to become one of the most powerful and influential dynasties in Chinese history, overseeing a period of cultural flourishing and territorial expansion. Zhu Yuanzhang's life, from orphaned peasant to emperor, serves as a powerful reminder of how the events of the 14th century, including the Black Death, reshaped the course of Chinese history. The plague, which had decimated the population and weakened the Yuan dynasty, ultimately paved the way for the rise of a new order. While the Mongols had once unified China under their rule, it was the suffering caused by their failure to respond to the crisis that led to their downfall. In the wake of the devastation, Zhu emerged as the leader who would bring hope and stability to a broken empire, founding a dynasty that would rule China for nearly 300 years. The Black Death's impact on China was profound, not only in terms of the immediate death toll, but also in the long-term consequences it had on the political landscape. The loss of life, the social unrest, and the collapse of the Yuan dynasty set the stage for the emergence of new leadership. Zhu Yuanzhang, who had witnessed the devastation caused by the plague, used his experiences to fuel his rise to power. His eventual victory and the establishment of the Ming dynasty were shaped by the events of the Black Death, which, in many ways, served as a turning point in Chinese history. Through it all, the resilience of the Chinese people in the face of unimaginable suffering laid the groundwork for the new chapter that would begin with the Ming dynasty. While Europe's Black Death is often the focal point of discussions surrounding the 14th century pandemic, the plague's impact on China is just as significant. The devastation that the plague caused in China is often overshadowed by the European narrative. but it serves as a powerful reminder of how interconnected the world was. Even in the 14th century, the pandemic was not confined to Europe. It traveled eastward, ravaging China, and then spread back westward, creating a global web of suffering that united distant continents in a shared experience of devastation. This historical event, which unfolded along the trade routes that connected the East and the West, reminds us that the world has always been far more interconnected than we often realize. The plague's journey across Asia and into China highlights the extent of this interconnectedness. The Mongol Empire, which at its height stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of China, was the conduit through which the plague traveled. Trade routes like the Silk Road were bustling with merchants, diplomats, and soldiers who, unknowingly, carried infected fleas on rats, facilitating the spread of the disease across vast distances. By the time the plague reached China, it was already sweeping across Europe and parts of the Middle East, and it would continue to circle the globe, infecting more people with each passing year. In China, the plague wreaked havoc, especially in the northern regions. Provinces like Hebei and Shanxi were hit first, where entire populations were decimated. The disease did not just affect rural areas. It also tore through urban centers, including the Yuan capital of Dadu, modern-day Beijing, where the death toll was catastrophic. Whole neighborhoods were emptied, markets closed, and the economy ground to a halt. The scale of the tragedy was so great that it was difficult for anyone, be it a commoner, a scholar, or even an emperor, to grasp the full extent of what was happening. It was clear that this was no ordinary disaster, but a force of nature that could not be stopped. Despite the devastation, the plague in China also teaches us valuable lessons that are still relevant today. One of the most important lessons is the vulnerability of even the most powerful empires to forces beyond their control. The Yuan dynasty, which had conquered vast territories and established a flourishing empire, was unable to withstand the plague's ferocious impact. The disease did not discriminate. It struck both the rich and the poor, the rulers and the ruled. In a way, the Black Death exposed the fragility of civilizations and reminded humanity that no empire, no matter how vast or powerful, is immune to microscopic foes. This reality was painfully clear in China, where the plague devastated not just the population but also the societal infrastructure. The social fabric began to unravel as the death toll mounted, and the empire's ability to govern was severely weakened. Local officials fled their posts, unable to deal with the overwhelming crisis, and rebellions began to break out in various regions, fueled by frustration and anger at the failure of the Mongol rulers to protect the people. What had once been a well-organized and prosperous empire was now in disarray, and the plague played a significant role in tipping the scales toward the collapse of the Yuan dynasty. The social unrest that followed, exacerbated by famine and the breakdown of authority, set the stage for the rise of a new order under Zhu Yuanzhang, who would eventually establish the Ming dynasty. But the Black Death in China also underscores the importance of accurate record-keeping and understanding pandemics and their effects on society. The historical records from this period, while sparse and often fragmented, provide crucial insights into the nature of the disease and its impact on different regions. These accounts, though sometimes exaggerated or imprecise, serve as valuable resources for historians and epidemiologists alike, helping us piece together the story of a global disaster. By studying these records, we can better understand how pandemics spread, how societies respond to such crises, and the long-term consequences of mass death on political, social, and economic systems. One of the challenges in studying the plague in China is the lack of comprehensive and detailed records. Unlike in Europe, where the Black Death was meticulously documented, the Chinese sources are often more general and less focused on specific details of the disease itself. Instead, the records tend to focus on the broader effects of the plague, such as the widespread death, the collapse of social order, and the disruption of agricultural production. While these accounts do not provide a full understanding of the plague's biological nature, they offer valuable insights into how the Chinese people experienced the pandemic. From these historical fragments, we can infer the emotional and psychological toll that the disease took on a population already suffering from political instability, famine, and environmental disasters. In addition to the lessons about vulnerability and record-keeping, the Black Death in China also serves as a poignant reminder of humanity's resilience. Despite the catastrophic loss of life and the upheaval caused by the plague, the Chinese people found ways to survive and rebuild. The devastation brought on by the pandemic weakened the Yuan dynasty, but it also paved the way for new leadership and a new chapter in Chinese history. Zhu Yuanzhang, a former peasant who had been orphaned by the plague, rose to power, eventually overthrowing the Mongols and founding the Ming dynasty. His story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Even in the darkest times, people found ways to adapt, to rebuild their communities, and to create new systems of governance. The Black Death may have shattered the old world, but it also laid the foundation for a new one. The Ming dynasty, which would go on to rule China for nearly 3 centuries, emerged from the ashes of the Yuan Empire, and the country eventually recovered from the devastation of the plague. While the effects of the pandemic were felt for generations, China's ability to rebuild, adapt, and flourish in the aftermath serves as a powerful reminder of the strength and resilience of human societies. Today, the Black Death's impact on China serves as both a historical lesson and a warning. It reminds us of the interconnectedness of the world, how events in one part of the globe can ripple across continents, shaping the course of history. It underscores the vulnerability of even the most powerful nations, and the importance of understanding how pandemics spread, and perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of humanity's ability to endure and rebuild, even in the face of unimaginable suffering and loss. As we confront modern global challenges, the lessons of the Black Death, both its devastation and its aftermath, can offer valuable insights into how we might respond to crises in the future. As we look back on the Black Death, both in China and across the world, we can see just how interconnected history truly is. The plague, though a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, was not confined to a single region or civilization. Its ripples were felt across continents, forever altering the course of human history. The Black Death did not only shape the future of one region, it left an indelible mark on the entire globe. The events that unfolded in China, the Middle East, and Europe, though distinct in their cultural, social, and political contexts, were linked by a common thread of suffering, survival, and ultimately resilience. In China, the plague struck hard, particularly in the northern regions, where the population was decimated, leaving entire provinces empty and cities abandoned. The Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, which had previously united a vast empire stretching from Asia to Europe, found itself struggling to maintain control in the face of the disease, famine, and rebellion. The devastating effects of the Black Death helped trigger the downfall of the Yuan dynasty, making way for the rise of the Ming dynasty, a new era of Chinese history. The tragic loss of life and the social chaos that followed were profound, but from this wreckage emerged the foundations for a new, more resilient society. Meanwhile, across Europe, the plague ravaged the population, killing millions in cities like Florence, London, and Paris, where its spread was exacerbated by urban overcrowding, lack of hygiene, and limited medical knowledge. Entire towns were wiped off the map, and the social, economic, and political structures of medieval Europe were thrown into disarray. However, just as in China, the Black Death also reshaped the future in ways that would eventually lead to progress. In the wake of such devastation, Europe saw the emergence of new social orders, shifts in the workforce, and the beginning of a new era of exploration, discovery, and innovation. The catastrophic loss of life, while tragic, spurred significant changes that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, a period of cultural and intellectual rebirth. The interconnectedness between these regions during the Black Death, facilitated by the global trade routes, reveals a profound lesson about the nature of pandemics. They do not respect borders or political boundaries. Whether through the movements of Mongol soldiers, merchants traveling the Silk Road, or the spread of disease via European trade ships, the Black Death showed that the world, though vast, was far more interconnected than previously imagined. A pandemic in one part of the world could easily ripple outward, crossing oceans and continents, affecting civilizations far beyond the initial epicenter. The Black Death thus serves as a stark reminder that no society is truly isolated, and the interconnectedness of the modern world only amplifies the need for global cooperation in facing such crises. The lessons from the Black Death's devastation are not only rooted in historical reflection, but also serve as vital insights for our modern world. As we face the ongoing fight against pandemics, today the experiences of the past provide valuable guidance. From China's response to Europe's struggle, we can see how societies, despite their vast differences, respond to pandemics with a mixture of fear, resilience, and ultimately, adaptation. Just as the Chinese people turned to religious rituals and practical measures to combat the plague, and European communities sought divine intervention while also implementing quarantine measures, our modern responses, though informed by advanced science and medicine, are no different in their essence. We too turn to both spiritual and practical solutions in moments of crisis, seeking ways to preserve life, protect communities, and restore some semblance of normalcy. The Black Death also underscores the importance of accurate record-keeping and data collection. In China, as in Europe, the lack of precise documentation made it difficult to understand the full scope of the pandemic's impact. While we now have the benefit of modern epidemiology and data science, the past reminds us that history must be carefully documented in order to understand the true impact of global events. Accurate data not only helps us understand the scale of the crisis, but also allows us to prepare for future pandemics. The lessons learned from the Black Death have shaped the way we approach public health today, from the establishment of disease surveillance systems to the development of vaccines and treatments. But perhaps most importantly, it shows us the need for global cooperation. In combating infectious diseases, humanity's resilience in the face of pandemics is another key takeaway from the Black Death. Both China and Europe were devastated by the plague, but in the aftermath, societies rebuilt. In China, the rise of the Ming dynasty marked a new chapter of stability, while in Europe, the rebuilding process spurred advancements in medicine, science, and governance. This resilience, our ability to endure, adapt, and rebuild in the face of loss, is one of the most powerful aspects of human nature. While the plague caused suffering beyond measure, it also led to progress in ways that may not have been possible without such a profound crisis. Just as the survivors of the Black Death rebuilt their societies, so too do we find the strength to rebuild after every crisis. The ongoing fight against pandemics today is deeply connected to the legacy of the Black Death. We have made tremendous strides in medical science and public health since the 14th century. But the fundamental challenges of combating a global pandemic remain the same. The interconnectedness of the world today, through global trade, travel, and communication, is far greater than it was in the 14th century, and while this brings countless benefits, it also means that the spread of disease is more rapid and far-reaching. As we face global health challenges such as COVID-19 and future potential pandemics, the lessons from the Black Death must continue to inform our responses. The resilience, adaptability, and solidarity demonstrated by people throughout history are the qualities we need to carry forward into the present and future. In the end, the Black Death, though a tragedy of monumental scale, is also a powerful testament to the resilience of humanity. It reminds us of the importance of learning from history, of understanding how interconnected our world truly is, and of the strength we draw from adversity. The plague's devastating impact on China, Europe, and beyond altered the course of history in ways that continue to shape our world today. As we face our own global challenges, we can take solace in the knowledge that, though pandemics may devastate us, they also reveal the unyielding spirit of humanity to rebuild, to adapt, and to grow.